For more than 100 years, no one had opened the resting place of a true king of Egypt. Every tomb uncovered since the early 20th century belonged to nobles, officials, or minor royals, never a reigning pharaoh. That changed when a team of archaeologists finally crawled into a narrow passage cut into the limestone hills west of the Valley of the Kings and found themselves standing inside a chamber that had been waiting, sealed and silent, since the height of Egypt's new kingdom. What they found there was not treasure. It was a mystery that would force historians to rethink everything they thought they understood about how a pharaoh's death was supposed to unfold. The location had been known for decades, in the loosest sense of the word. On old survey maps of the Theban necropolis, a small notation marked a patch of desert roughly 2.5 kilometers from the main valley. It had a designation, nothing more, no excavation report, no photographs, no serious investigation. Generation after generation of archaeologists walked past it, assuming it was either irrelevant or already picked clean. That assumption held for over 100 years, and it is precisely what preserved the site until a joint Egyptian and British excavation team decided the location deserved a second look. The work that followed was nothing like the popular image of archaeology. There was no dramatic reveal in the first afternoon, no golden glint catching the sunlight. Instead, there were months of brutal, unglamorous labor, clearing tons of compacted debris under the desert sun, moving rock and sediment by hand because heavy machinery had no place in a site this fragile and this remote. The team had no guarantee that anything of significance waited beneath the rubble. They kept digging anyway. Eventually, they exposed an entrance. It was startlingly small, barely wide enough for an adult to fit through, and only by turning sideways, stripping off any bulky equipment, and pushing forward on their stomach through total darkness for several meters. It was the kind of passage that raised an immediate question. What civilization builds an entrance this constrictive for the burial of a king, an event that traditionally required moving massive stone sarcophagi, wooden shrines, and ceremonial furniture into the chamber below? When the excavators finally stood upright inside, the first thing they noticed was not gold or painted walls. It was a drop. The corridor floor ended abruptly, more than a meter above the floor of the chamber beneath it, with no ramp, no stairway, nothing but a sheer vertical face of cut stone. Anyone walking the corridor in ancient times would have reached the edge and found themselves staring down into darkness, with no way to lower anything heavy, let alone a stone sarcophagus weighing several tons, without extraordinary effort and risk. At first, this looked like a construction failure, an incomplete project abandoned partway through. But a closer look at the tool marks around the drop told a different story. The cuts were precise, clean, and showed no evidence of a change in plan. Whoever built this had intended for the corridor to end exactly this way. It was not an accident. It was a decision. Beneath the drop, the floor of the chamber was buried under a thick layer of hardened sediment, nearly as solid as concrete. The reason became clear once the team studied the cliffs above the tomb. The site sat directly beneath the path of seasonal flash floods. Rainfall in this part of the desert is rare but violent, and when it comes, water pours down the rock face and funnels straight through the tomb's entrance. Over 3.5 millennia, repeated flooding had packed the chamber floor with layer after layer of mineral-rich mud, each flood compressing the one before it into something almost as hard as stone. It took the excavation team weeks of careful, painstaking work simply to remove enough of this hardened flood residue to see what lay beneath. It was in that sediment, wedged into crevices in the rock, that the team recovered small fragments of alabaster and plaster vessels. On several of the fragments, faint hieroglyphic inscriptions survived, royal titles belonging to a king of the 18th dynasty whose reign had left almost no physical trace anywhere else in the archaeological record. These fragments were, in fact, the very first objects ever definitively linked to this pharaoh's burial. It should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it opened a much darker line of inquiry, because nothing about the tomb's design made sense for a king who was supposed to be honored, not obstructed, on his way into the afterlife. To understand why this tomb was built the way it was, you have to understand the man it was built for and how little the ancient world seemed to care about him. Egyptologists still argue about the basic facts of his reign. Depending on which scholar you ask, he sat on the throne for as few as 3 years or as many as 13. That kind of uncertainty is almost unheard of for a pharaoh. By comparison, historians can reconstruct the reigns of his father and his son almost year by year. That gap in the record is itself telling. He inherited the throne not through conquest or achievement, but simply through the order of succession. His father had been one of Egypt's great military expansionists, pushing the kingdom's borders outward through a series of campaigns that reshaped the region. His own son would grow up to become one of the most formidable commanders in the ancient world, a king still studied today for his tactical brilliance. Sandwiched between these two towering figures, this pharaoh's reign reads like an intermission, quiet, unremarkable, and largely undocumented. His mummified remains, examined long after his death, revealed signs of a chronic illness that likely affected his skin and internal organs, suggesting a ruler who may have spent much of his time on the throne in poor health. In a culture where the pharaoh's authority was tied directly to an image of physical vigor and divine strength, a visibly ailing king was vulnerable. His grip on power depended heavily on the loyalty, or the ambition, of the people surrounding him. Chief among them was his own wife, who was also his half-sister, following the royal custom of the period. Nearly every surviving record from this era suggests she was the sharper political mind of the two. While he sat on the throne, she was already accumulating religious titles and administrative influence, positioning herself for a role far larger than that of a supporting consort. When he died, she did not simply step aside for the young heir. She became regent for his infant son, then, after roughly 2 years, took the extraordinary step of declaring herself pharaoh in her own right, commissioning artwork that depicted her with the traditional false beard and masculine regalia of a reigning king, and even having temple walls carved with a myth of her own divine conception to cement her legitimacy. She never erased her late husband's name, though. She needed it. His name was the legal bridge connecting her rule to the unbroken line of royal succession, and she made sure it remained visible wherever it served that purpose. In death, he became more politically useful to her than he had ever been in life, which brings us back to the strange, deliberately flawed tomb built to receive him. Egyptian master builders of this era were not amateurs. They studied the behavior of desert water flow across generations and chose tomb locations with enormous care, specifically to avoid flooding. Placing this tomb directly in the path of seasonal runoff was not an oversight. It was a decision made by people who understood exactly what would happen as a result. The architect responsible for the project was one of the most experienced tomb builders of his generation, a man who had already overseen construction projects for multiple pharaohs before him. In an inscription from his own burial, he left behind a single unsettling line, stating that he had once built a royal tomb entirely alone, with no one seeing and no one hearing the work. Scholars have debated the meaning of that phrase for years. One persistent theory, never fully dismissed, is that the workers involved in certain sensitive royal construction projects were eliminated once their work was finished, ensuring the location of the tomb died with them. Whatever happened to the laborers who dug this particular passage, their names never appear in any surviving payroll or work log, as though they were quietly removed from the historical record. Every design choice compounded the pattern. The entrance was too narrow to move the large ceremonial shrines and furniture that traditionally accompanied a royal burial, a limitation the builders would have understood before they ever cut the first stone. The vertical drop at the end of the corridor made a proper, respectful burial all but physically impossible, lowering a multi-ton sarcophagus over that ledge without a ramp or support structure risked destroying both the coffin and the body inside it, in a space lit only by flickering oil lamps. Then there were the wall paintings. Fragments recovered from the chamber depicted scenes from an ancient funerary text describing the sun god's nightly journey through 12 hours of the underworld. Tombs of this period commonly use this text for spiritual protection, but the specific section chosen for this tomb was among the most violent and punishing passages in the entire composition, imagery of condemned souls being executed and consumed by fire. That was not a comforting message for the dead king. It read more like a warning to anyone who might later interfere with whatever was really happening inside that chamber. The true purpose of the tomb only became clear when one member of the excavation team climbed down into the lower chamber and turned to look back up at that strange vertical wall. From the corridor above, it had seemed like a senseless barrier. From below, its function was obvious. The ledge sat at precisely the right height for a group of people standing in the lower chamber to lift heavy objects and push them up into the passage above. No ropes, no pulleys, nothing but coordinated human effort. This was not a tomb built to keep something safely inside for eternity. It was built to move things out quickly and efficiently under pressure. The evidence supported this conclusion at every turn. The chamber was completely empty, but it showed none of the telltale signs of robbery. No smashed containers, no soot from robbers' torches, no scattered debris left behind by looters working in haste and darkness. Instead, everything appeared to have been removed in an organized, deliberate operation, carried out not by criminals but by people acting with full institutional authority. Among the fragments recovered from the flood sediment, researchers found something particularly striking. Several inscriptions included blessings invoking long life for the living queen who would later crown herself pharaoh, an unusual and pointed detail to include on burial equipment meant for a dead king. It suggested she was not merely present as a mourning widow. She was directing the operation. The physical evidence didn't end at the tomb. When this king's mummified remains were examined by researchers decades earlier, long before this tomb was ever found, they noted a series of injuries that had never been fully explained. One arm was broken at the shoulder. The other was separated at the elbow. For over a century, these injuries were attributed to ancient tomb robbers rummaging carelessly through the wrappings in search of jewelry. But robbery injuries tend to be chaotic and inconsistent, inflicted by people tearing and smashing indiscriminately in the dark. These injuries followed a distinct, repeatable pattern, consistent with a wrapped body being hoisted upward from below while its own weight pulled downward, then dragged across a hard stone edge in a confined space. In other words, consistent with exactly the kind of emergency removal this tomb's architecture was built to perform, likely carried out as floodwater rose around the feet of the people doing the lifting. After the chamber was emptied, someone gave the order not simply to seal the tomb, as was customary, but to bury it completely. Rather than the standard practice of blocking the doorway with stone and plaster, workers spent multiple seasons packing tons of rubble and earth over the entrance, eventually burying it under enough fill to erase any surface trace that it had ever existed. No administrative record of this operation has ever surfaced, a striking omission in a bureaucracy that otherwise documented nearly everything, down to the daily rations of individual laborers. The only person in Egypt with the authority to organize an operation of this scale, in near total secrecy, was the ruling monarch, and by the time this concealment likely took place, that monarch was the same queen who had declared herself pharaoh. Yet even as she later worked to secure her own legacy, she never erased her late husband's name from the record. She needed it too much. His identity remained the legal foundation her own reign stood on. Every detail uncovered inside this chamber points to the same unavoidable conclusion. This was never meant to be a final resting place. It was a transfer point, a location used briefly, then deliberately hidden, while the king's remains and burial goods were relocated somewhere else entirely. That true, final tomb has never been located. Researchers using ground-penetrating radar have identified several unexplored anomalies beneath the surrounding cliffs, at least one aligned plausibly with a route leading away from this chamber, though none has yet been confirmed or opened. If that second tomb is ever found intact, it would represent something unprecedented, the only complete royal burial assemblage ever recovered from this king's reign. Not a single object confirmed to belong to him currently exists in any museum collection anywhere in the world. Whatever waits in that hidden chamber would not simply be historical treasure. It would be the missing physical record of a pharaoh history nearly forgot, assembled, ironically, by the very woman who orchestrated his hurried, undignified removal from the tomb built, from its very first cut stone, to fail.